tormentors slashed her gown in front of Academy. Her soaring boot knocked him against a wall. Serafina Bellwether understood years before that calmness was her armor. At 17 years old, she gave off a kind of muted presence, which seemed to make her unseen in the bustling corridors of Oakhaven Academy. Her slender form, barely reaching 5'4", drifted through the school almost like a phantom. Auburn hair constantly kept back in a plain braid, roomy cardigans concealing her fragile frame. 5 months had passed since her kin had journeyed from Inverness, and she still felt like a newcomer exploring unknown territory. The language differences had largely faded, although the societal ones remained as strong as granite. While other scholars gathered in boisterous crowds, exchanging quips and weekend plans, Serafina lunched by herself, finished tasks without uttering a sound, and averted gaze whenever possible. She had perfected the craft of being unnoticeable. What they didn't comprehend was that underneath those baggy clothes resided sinews honed since infancy. Every dawn at 4, whilst her classmates slumbered, Serafina honed techniques her grandmother had shown her in their cramped apartment's parlor. Highland swordplay coursed through her like vitality, each stance imprinted through endless practice. Her sire had been a champion until a wound ended his calling, and her grandmother prior had trained warriors in the Scottish Highlands. However, here, in this American boarding school, she was simply the silent redhead lass who spoke meekly and stayed to herself. "Just endure the day," she told herself each morn. "Do not seek notice, do not grant them motives." The badgering had started subtly, murmured quips about her accent when she spoke in lessons. "Brave heart," whispered just audibly enough for her to catch as she passed specific lockers. Texts accidentally dropped from her grasp in busy hallways. She endured it all with the same tranquil look she wore during meditation, never reacting, never even accepting the attacks. The chief agitator was Reginald Sterling, a towering 6'2" rugby player whose kin had controlled Oakhaven's social structure for generations. His dark hair was constantly flawlessly brushed, his varsity sweater donned like armor, and his cold grey eyes seemed to seek out vulnerability. The manor sharks sensed blood. His nearest allies were Jasper Finch, wiry and swift with a cruel smirk, and Alistair Hayes, whose ginger hair matched his volatile disposition. "Look what floated in from the lock," Reginald would announce whenever Serafina entered the dining hall. His table would burst with laughter while she pretended not to hear, finding her customary spot near the windows where she could dine in relative peace. Ms. Abernathy, the overworked meal supervisor, constantly seemed to be gazing elsewhere when these occurrences happened. The other educators were either unaware or chose ignorance over action. Even the scholars who might have spoken out found reasons to look away. Serafina grasped. Getting mixed up meant becoming a target. She had faced worse in Inverness, where her mixed ancestry made her stand out amongst her fully Scottish peers. At minimum here, she reasoned, the isolation felt fleeting. Her father's job relocation would probably move them again within a year or two. She just had to survive until then. The music chamber served as her refuge during meal periods, when the dining hall became unbearable. Most scholars shunned the vacant space, but Serafina found tranquility amidst the instruments and echo of her steps. She would sit in the gallery, completing homework, or simply breathing in the familiar scent of polished wood that reminded her of her grandmother's cottage. It was there, on a Wednesday in November, that Reginald and his crew trapped her for the first time. "Well, well, Little Highland sprite believes she can conceal herself from us." Reginald's voice resonated off the music chamber walls as he advanced with Jasper and Alistair guarding him. "We've been searching all over for you." Serafina closed her textbook gradually, her heartbeat stable despite the threat. Years of training had instructed her to remain composed under pressure. "Assess the setting, seek exits, stay prepared. What's amiss?" Bagpipes fail to amuse? Jasper sneered, stepping closer. Or do you only converse in Gaelic verse? Alistair chortled, a grating sound that felt too loud in the vacant space. Maybe she's praying to her Celtic gods or whatnot. I need to reach lessons, Serafina said gently, rising and collecting her texts. Her voice stayed steady, betraying none of the calculations racing through her thoughts. 3 adversaries, all taller, though confined space lessened their ability to surround her wholly. Lessons do not commence for 20 minutes, Reginald said, obstructing her path to the exit. We desire to have a brief chat first. About what? She inquired, though she already knew this discussion had nothing to do with communication and everything to do with asserting dominance. About respect, Reginald said, his smirk turning predatory. See, we do not admire foreigners entering our academy and acting like they possess the place. I do not act like anything, Serafina replied. I simply wish to be left in peace. That's the issue, Jasper chimed in. You assume you're too superior for us, strutting about like some mysterious Celtic queen. Serafina almost grinned at that. If only they knew how close to the truth they were. Listen, she said, attempting to step around Reginald. I desire no trouble. Reginald seized her arm, his grasp firm, though not yet painful. Nobody stated you could depart. For just a moment, Serafina felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that predated action. Her sinews tensed, prepared to break his hold with a simple wrist turn that would leave him wheezing on the ground, although she forced herself to relax. Not yet, not unless you lack choice. Please release me, she said instead. Reginald's grasp tightened. Say, please, Master Reginald. Nay! The single word lingered in the air like a challenge. Alistair cracked his knuckles whilst Jasper shifted to obstruct any alternate escape route. The sound of the music chamber door swinging open spared her from whatever would have transpired next. Hey! What's transpiring here? Coach McTavish's voice cut through the tension like a blade. You kids know you're not permitted to be here during luncheon. Reginald released Serafina's arm instantly, his look shifting to innocent bewilderment. Simply conversing with the new lass, Coach. Making her feel welcome. Coach McTavish's wary gaze moved between them, although Serafina had already grasped that adults rarely perceived what they did not wish to perceive. Well, welcome her elsewhere. Music chambers off limits. As they filed out, Reginald whispered just audibly enough for her to hear, This is not over, Highland Sprite. That eve, Serafina practiced until her sinews screamed. In the solitude of her family's cramped apartment, she moved through stances with lethal precision, picturing each block and strike connecting with genuine targets. Her grandmother had constantly stated that true might resided not in the ability to battle, although in the wisdom to know when battling was necessary. She could still sense Reginald's grasp on her arm, the casual manner he had assumed ownership of her space, her time, her very existence. The recollection ignited something perilous in her chest. Her movements became sharper, more aggressive, each kata executed with barely contained fury. Her mother watched from the kitchen doorway, recognizing the signs of inner turmoil in her daughter's exact violence. Serafina-chan, she called gently, is everything all right at the academy? Fine, Mama, Serafina replied without breaking form, her fist slicing through the air where an imaginary opponent's ribs would be. Simply staying in practice. Although it wasn't fine, and they both knew it, her mother had seen those same movements in her husband's training, back when he prepared for competitions that mattered. This was not practice. This was preparation for war. When will that moment arrive, she wondered, sweat dripping onto the worn carpet. Deep in her heart, she suspected it would be soon. The harassment intensified gradually over the following weeks. Reginald and his friends seemed to take her silence as invitation rather than deterrent. They began timing their movements to hers, appearing wherever she attempted to find solitude. The library became hostile territory when they took to making loud, mocking conversations about immigrants taking over. The hallways turned into gauntlets where she never knew when someone would shoulder check her into a locker. The worst part was how unseen it all seemed to everyone else. Educators gazed right through the subtle torment happening under their noses. Other scholars developed selective blindness whenever Reginald's crew struck. The conspiracy of willful ignorance felt more suffocating than the actual bullying. "Simply disregard them," her mother advised when Serafina finally mentioned having some social difficulties at the academy. "Show them you're superior to their behavior." Her father, nursing his perpetually aching knee, was more direct. "You wish me to go to the academy, converse with the headmaster?" "Nay, Dad. I can handle it." And she believed she could. Years of training had prepared her for far worse than teenage cruelty. Although as November turned to December, the incidents grew bolder, more public, more humiliating. The breaking point came on a Friday before winter break. Serafina had donned her favorite gown to academy that day, a plain green wool piece her grandmother had dispatched from Scotland. It was one of the few items that made her feel connected to home, and she'd been anticipating donning it to the small holiday gathering her one friendly acquaintance, Gwyneth, had invited her to attend. She was walking toward her last lesson when Reginald stepped directly into her path. "Well, gaze at this," he announced loudly, drawing attention from dozens of nearby scholars. "Princess Scotia decided to dress up for us." A crowd began to gather, sensing drama. Serafina attempted to step around him, although Jasper and Alistair appeared, completing the human wall that trapped her in the hallway intersection. "That's a pretty gown," Reginald continued, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden hush. "Pity it makes you resemble a shepherdess who strayed." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Serafina felt heat rise in her cheeks, although kept her look neutral. "Walk away. Discover another route. Do not engage." "Where are you departing, sweetheart?" Reginald inquired as she turned. "We're simply getting commenced." "Release me alone," she said gently, although her words were lost in the growing noise of entertained spectators. "What was that?" Reginald cupped his ear dramatically. "Sorry, I do not converse in Gaelic." "She stated release her alone," Gwyneth's voice cut through the crowd. Serafina's heart sank as her only friend pushed forward, attempting to aid. "Come on, Reginald. Simply permit her to reach lessons." "Oh, gaze," Jasper sneered. "The shepherdess possesses a white savior." "Back off, Gwyneth," Alistair added. "This does not concern you." "Bullying concerns everyone," Gwyneth replied, though Serafina could sense the tremor in her voice. Reginald's eyes lit up with malicious inspiration. "You know what? You're right. This does concern everyone." He raised his voice to address the entire hallway. "Everyone should perceive what transpires to people who assume they're too superior for American hospitality." Before Serafina could react, Reginald reached out and seized the neckline of her gown. With one violent motion, he yanked downward, tearing the delicate fabric from collar to hem. The sound of ripping wool seemed to echo forever in the sudden silence. Serafina stood frozen, her gown hanging in tatters, her white slip visible to dozens of staring eyes. The careful composure she'd maintained for months cracked like ice under pressure. Humiliation burned through her chest as phones appeared, recording her exposure for digital immortality. "This is what helplessness feels like," she realized with crystal clarity. "This is what transpires when you permit others to define your boundaries." "Oops," Reginald said with mock concern. "Looks like your cheap foreign clothes cannot handle American strength." Something fundamental shifted inside Serafina's chest. The part of her that had counseled patience and peace suddenly went silent. replaced by a voice that sounded exactly like her grandmother's. "Some battles choose you, Serafina-chan. When they do, you must be ready." She gazed up at Reginald, and for the first time since arriving at Oakhaven Academy, she met his gaze directly. What he perceived there made his satisfied smirk falter slightly. "You simply made a very big mistake," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the silence. Reginald recovered swiftly, puffing out his chest. "Oh yeah? What are you going to do about it, Highland?" He never completed the word. Serafina moved like lightning given form. Her right foot snapped upward in a perfect Highland kick, connecting with Reginald's solar plexus with surgical precision. The kick lifted him wholly off his feet, dispatching him flying backward into the metal lockers with a crash that shook the entire hallway. The sound of his body striking steel was followed by perfect silence. Reginald slumped to the ground, gasping for breath that would not come, his face turning an alarming shade of purple. His friends stared in shock as this tiny lass who had never raised her voice suddenly stood like a warrior goddess in the middle of their conquered territory. "Oh my God," someone whispered. Jasper was the first to recover, lunging forward with his fists raised. Serafina sidestepped his wild swing with fluid grace, seized his extended arm, and utilized his own momentum to dispatch him, face first, into the same lockers that had just acquainted themselves with Reginald. The metallic clang of his impact was followed by the distinct sound of his nose breaking. Alistair, perceiving his two friends crumpled on the ground, backpedaled rapidly. "Jesus Christ, what the hell are you?" Serafina did not answer. She simply reached down and gathered the torn pieces of her gown, holding them against her chest whilst maintaining eye contact with every person in the hallway. Her breathing was perfectly controlled, her stance relaxed though ready. She resembled someone who could end worlds without breaking a sweat. "I am someone who attempted very hard to avert this moment," she said finally, her voice carrying to every corner of the hallway. "I am someone who believed that walking away was strength, that silence was wisdom, that peace was constantly possible." She gazed down at Reginald, who was still struggling to breathe normally. "I was mistaken." The crowd parted before her like the Red Sea as she walked toward the nearest lavatory. Behind her, Reginald finally managed to wheeze out something that might have been an apology, though she did not turn around. "Let them recall this," she thought as she pushed through the lavatory door. "Let them all recall what transpires when peaceful people reach their limit." The aftermath was swift and decisive, By the time Serafina emerged from the lavatory donning her gym clothes, the headmaster was waiting with 2 security guards and a very pale-looking Reginald Sterling. His friends had been taken to the nurse's office, Jasper for his broken nose, Alistair for what appeared to be a panic attack. "Miss Bellwether," Headmaster Davies said carefully, "we need to converse." The conversation in his office was surreal. Reginald, looking smaller than she'd ever perceived him, mumbled through an explanation that painted him as the victim of an unprovoked attack. His version of events conveniently omitted the torn gown, the months of harassment, or any context that might explain her actions. "Is this true?" Headmaster Davies inquired Serafina. "Did you assault Mr. Sterling without provocation?" Serafina considered her options. She could lie, minimize, explain. She could attempt to make adults comprehend what they'd been willfully ignoring for months, or she could simply own the moment completely. She said calmly. "I did." Headmaster Davies blinked, clearly having anticipated denials or excuses. "Can you explain why?" "He destroyed my gown in front of the entire academy. He and his friends have been tormenting me for months, whilst educators and scholars watched and did nothing. Today, I decided I was done being their victim." "That does not justify violence," Headmaster Davies began. "Does it not?" Serafina interrupted, her voice still perfectly calm. "At what point does defending yourself become justified?" "After the 100th insult. after physical assault, after public humiliation. I'm curious where you draw that line, sir. The headmaster looked uncomfortable. Reginald shifted in his chair, wincing from his bruised ribs. There are proper channels, Headmaster Davies said weakly. Which channels? Serafina inquired. The educators who gazed the other way. The meal supervisors who were constantly distracted. The administrators who were too busy to notice months of systematic harassment. Those channels. Headmaster Davies had no good answer. The conversation ended with all parties receiving equal suspension. 3 days for fighting on academy property. Reginald's parents, pillars of the community, were outraged that their son was being punished for being brutally attacked by a foreign scholar. Serafina's parents, after hearing the full story, quietly supported their daughter whilst publicly expressing appropriate concern for all involved. The real changes began when lessons resumed. Serafina returned to academy to find herself transformed from unseen target to visible force. Scholars parted in hallways, although now it was from respect rather than indifference. The whispered conversations followed her movements, although the tone had shifted completely. Did you perceive what she did to Reginald Sterling? One kick, and he was finished. She moves like she's in a film. I heard she's been training since she was little. Jasper's nose is never going to gaze right again. Reginald himself had become a cautionary tale. The swaggering bully who had terrorized younger scholars was now the laughingstock who got demolished by a lass half his size. His friends gave him a wide berth, unwilling to be associated with such spectacular defeat. His girlfriend dumped him, citing embarrassment as the reason. The most significant change was in how others behaved around Serafina. Scholars who had watched her torment for months without intervention suddenly seemed to recall their voices. "I'm sorry," Gwyneth said during luncheon that first day back. "I should have spoken up sooner." "Way sooner." "We all should have," added Alistair Munro, a quiet lad who had witnessed many of the incidents. "What we did was mistaken. What we didn't do was worse. Even some educators seemed to regard Serafina differently. Mr. Campbell, her history educator, stopped her after lessons. "I owe you an apology," he said gently. "I perceived what was transpiring and convinced myself it wasn't my business. That was cowardice on my part." "It's all right," Serafina replied, though they both knew it wasn't. "Nay, it's not. Although thank you for handling it yourself when the adults in your life failed you." The strangest transformation was in Reginald Sterling himself. The broken nose had healed, although something deeper remained damaged. He no longer strutted through hallways like a conquering hero. His cruelty toward other scholars simply ceased, as if her kick had knocked the bully right out of him. 2 weeks after the incident, he approached her locker. "I need to converse with you," he said gently. Serafina closed her locker and turned to face him, noting how he unconsciously took a step backward. "All right?" I desired to say. He struggled with words that had never been part of his vocabulary. "I'm sorry for everything. The gown, the comments, all of it. I was mistaken." Serafina studied his face, seeking signs of deception or hidden agenda. She found only genuine remorse and something that might have been fear. "Why?" she inquired. "Because you were right. About what you said in the headmaster's office. There should have been a line and I crossed it a long time ago. I never thought about what it felt like from your side." "And now you do?" Reginald nodded, his earlier confidence completely absent. "I keep thinking about how scared you must have been. How alone you felt. I made someone feel that way on purpose, and that's..." He struggled for the word. "That's evil." Serafina felt something loosen in her chest. Not forgiveness exactly, although the absence of active anger. "Thank you for stating that," she said finally. "It does not undo what happened, although it matters that you comprehend." I know I do not deserve forgiveness, Reginald continued, although I desire you to know that I'll never do anything like that again, to you or anyone else. As he walked away, Serafina realized that her grandmother had been right about more than just battling. True might wasn't simply knowing when to act, it was knowing when to show mercy to defeated enemies. The rest of the academy year passed quietly. Serafina's reputation as someone not to be trifled with spread throughout Oakhaven Academy, although more importantly, she had found her voice. She spoke up in lessons, joined the Academy's cultural awareness group, and even convinced the administration to implement a more effective anti-bullying program. Other scholars began approaching her, not simply those seeking protection, although those who recognized in her the kind of quiet strength they wished to develop themselves. She started an informal Highland martial arts group that met after academy, teaching basic self-defense to anyone who desired to learn. The goal is not to harm people, she would tell her scholars. The goal is to be so clearly capable of protecting yourself that no one ever tests that capability. Her favorite scholar was a small freshman named Ewan, who reminded her of herself just months earlier. Shy, bookish, and frequently targeted by older scholars, he had joined her group out of desperation. "I do not desire to harm anyone," he confided after his first lesson. "I simply desire them to release me alone." "That's exactly right," Serafina replied. "Violence should constantly be the last option. Although sometimes people will not grant you any other choice. When that moment comes, you need to be ready." On the last day of academy, Serafina found a note in her locker. It was from Gwyneth, who had become a genuine friend over the final months. "Thank you for showing all of us what real courage gaze is like. Not the fake kind that comes from harming people weaker than you, although the real kind that comes from standing up when it matters most. You changed everything here, and I hope you know that." Serafina grinned, folding the note carefully. She had indeed changed everything, not simply at Oakhaven Academy, although within herself. The silent lass who had arrived in September was gone, replaced by someone who comprehended that peace was not the absence of conflict, although the presence of justice. Her grandmother would have been proud. She had learned that true warriors battle not because they love violence, although because they love something enough to protect it. Sometimes that something was others. Sometimes it was simply their own dignity. As she walked out of Oakhaven Academy for the last time, Serafina carried herself differently. Her posture was straighter, her gaze more direct, her presence more substantial. She was no longer unseen, no longer a target, no longer afraid. She was Serafina Bellwether, and she had learned that the strongest people are often those who choose not to utilize their strength until the moment when they absolutely must. The torn gown had been beyond repair, although what it represented had been rebuilt stronger than ever. Sometimes the most important battles are the ones that teach everyone watching that there are consequences for cruelty, that victims can become victors, and that silent people should never be mistaken for powerless people. Reginald Sterling learned that lesson the hard way. So did everyone else at Oakhaven Academy, who had chosen to gaze away when gazing was what was needed most. Although most importantly, Serafina learned that she had been strong enough all along. She had just needed to discover the moment when being strong mattered more than staying safe.